Hi everyone, it's Eliana again with card number 4 from the Simon Says Stamp Card Kit for 2014. I'm first taking a scrap piece of cardstock, and this is the Paper Tray Ink Stamper Select white cardstock, and I'm just priming it with my powder tool because I will be embossing. I'm taking one of the ice cream bars from the stamp set and I'm mounting it onto an acrylic block, and I'm going to be inking it with my Versamark and then just stamping it onto the paper and using my gold embossing powder. This embossing powder is the Recollections kind. It's the one you get at Michael's, and it actually is pretty good. It has very fine detail, and it did really well with the small script writing in the sentiment later on in the card. But I'm just using it to coat my ice cream cone. And there's a little bit of a stray piece of embossing powder, and I just used a dry watercolor paintbrush to remove it. And I've warmed up my heat gun and I've just melted the embossing powder. And I'm going to be using Copic colors, and so I just took some scrap paper and I just put it underneath my image, and I've sped this part up. And I put that scrap paper underneath just so that if it bleeds through, it won't mark up my cutting mat. And I'm just using the same colors that I've been using all along, just the very few that I have. And I only have 2 green markers that are of this color family. And so I do have a little bit of trouble blending them in. So what I do is I take the lighter color and I touch the tip against the darker color, and that kind of helps it blend together. And so it does turn out to be pretty good. So I was quite pleased with that. And for the yellow, I just use 3 different shades of yellow, just whatever I had. And I'm starting with the lightest color, just coloring the whole thing. And I am by no means any kind of a Copic expert. I just kind of go with the flow and just what I've seen other people do, and I just make it work with what I have. Copic colors are kind of expensive, and so I don't really have a ton of colors. And if I could, I would have every color there is, but you know, such is life. And once I'm pleased with the colors, I take my antique linen distress marker and I just color it onto the corner of my acrylic block there, and I use my watercolor brush. I don't have a very light cream colored Copic, so that worked for just adding a little bit of color to that. So I've trimmed out my piece, and I'm using a gold metallic marker to color the edge of my cutout piece there. And I've pulled out my Big Shot, and I will be using the Simon Says Stamp Frames die set. I have a piece of basil cardstock vellum. It's just a little bit thicker than normal cardstock, normal vellum, but it works fine for embossing, which I'll be doing. And I've taken the other frame that comes in the set, just the plain square one, rectangular one I mean, and I've cut it out of the red pattern paper. Now the vellum I cut using the scalloped frame that comes in the set, but I'm not using the scallop frame. I'm using the other piece that comes out of that when you cut it out. It's just the center piece, and it's just a rectangle with rounded corners. And you could just trim out a piece of vellum and then round the corners, but I really wanted to use these dies. I hadn't had a chance to use them yet. So I've put my piece of vellum in MISTI, and I'm just putting my sentiment and my ice cream onto that piece of vellum just to get placement, trying to figure out where I want to place the sentiment. And I'm going to use the lines on the grid paper, and I know that horizontally they are straight, and so I'm just using that as a reference to line up one of the words and I'm closing the lid. I'm going to be prepping it with my embossing bag because I will be embossing it with the gold embossing powder. And you do notice that I had my nails done. I didn't really have them done. My daughter had a jamboree party last night, and you know, everyone has to participate, and so she picked out these colors for me because she wanted to be matchy-matchy with me. So that's why I have my nails done. So I'm taking the piece of vellum and I'm just coating it with the gold embossing powder. And I'm just tapping it onto this scrap piece of paper, and then I will be funneling it back into my container. I'll heat emboss it to melt the powder, and my gun is really warm, and so it melts it pretty fast. It doesn't even warp my vellum. And once I've done that, I'm going to put the rest of my card together. And what I've done is I've cut down the piece of pattern paper that had the colorful scallops, and I've cut it down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 so that it can be mounted onto the front of a card. I'll put the vellum next, and then I'll put the red little frame on top of that. And that's the design that I'm kind of going for. So to adhere my piece of pattern paper, I'm just going to use my ATG gun. And what I typically do is just go around all the corners as close to the edge as I can so that it doesn't lift up. And then I turn my cardstock so that the piece of the cardstock that is creased is on the table, and I just line the pieces up, and then you get perfect alignment. If your paper is cut square, then it'll line up each time, and you can just trim off any of the edges that overhang. And so I'm going to go ahead and mount my little ice cream. That way I can at least put some adhesive behind that so that it doesn't show on the vellum. I know that they make vellum adhesive, but I'm not sure why they call it that, because it still shows no matter what you do, it still shows up. So maybe somebody will make some actual adhesive that doesn't show through vellum sometime soon, because I know I will buy it. And so I'm removing the little plastic covering on the foam adhesive, and I'm just going to place it right onto the front of the card. I'm going to try to line everything up so that I know where I want it to go. And then I'm just going to put that little piece right there. And I liked the vellum so that it tones down that busy pattern paper, and I just thought it was really pretty paper. And I think you could probably get by with not putting the vellum on there, but I really wanted to use the little frames, and so this is what I came up with. So I did use the vellum adhesive behind the words, and that worked behind there. I had tested it out on one of the corners and it still showed. So I know that you want to put it on the paper you're going to be adhering the vellum to. So you don't put it on the vellum, you put it on the pattern paper. And once I've done that, I take my frame and I'm going to spray it with some of Aleene's tacky spray. And I just had the hardest time getting this little frame to go on this card straight. If I had to do it over again, I probably would have used the centerpiece of the die cut that goes inside, and I probably would have set that down first and then adhered my frame around the edge of it, but I should have, thought of that sooner. So what I do now is I take that negative cut and I try to center it where I think the frame needs to go, and my frame is starting to lose its tackiness because I've just messed with it for so much. And so I'm just using the edge of that negative cut to try to line it up as best I can. And because that left side of that frame is so thin, it's not very useful. I should have just turned the piece of paper over and used the other side, used it to do the other side, but you know, when you're on camera, you're not thinking straight. So I'm using a magnet, and I did slide a piece of metal underneath my craft mat to make it magnetic, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. So I'm trying to just push the edge of that die cut against that straight edge of the paper, and I kind of suffered a little bit here, and I'm suffering now just trying to talk to you about it. So I'm very sorry if this is a little torturous to watch me put on this little frame around this part of the card. But I hope you're still watching. And once I get that down, woohoo! I get my liquid adhesive, and I'm just going to get the adhesive going on the tip. And I'm just going to put little dots of adhesive on the underside of the vellum where the frame is, so that it will be hidden by the frame once I push it down. You want to be very careful to put tiny, tiny little dots. Right here is where I put a little too much, and then you end up seeing the adhesive through the vellum, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to cover that up. So I go all the way around, just lifting up small pieces at a time, just small sections at a time, just to get that frame down. And when I'm completely done, I see that there is adhesive, and I end up just putting gold enamel dots to hide it. And it turns out to be okay, so I'm not too disappointed with that. And well, I'll tell you a little bit now about how I made my mat magnetic, since I've already told you what I'm going to be doing on this part. If you go to your local hardware store and you just get a small sheet of metal flashing, and you can just get the very thin metal flashing there in the smallest size, or whatever size you want to use, and you just put that underneath your craft mat, those super magnets that come with MISTI, those will stick through your craft mat and your paper, and your mat is magnetic. And so if you have one of those big mats, you could do that. Or if you wanted to just do a small section of your mat, maybe half of it, you can just get a piece of metal that's appropriate. And I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that you give it a thumbs up and you subscribe, and head on over to my website and check MISTI out there, and also subscribe to the blog there. And I hope you have a great day.